Welcome, everyone, to Gramercy Books Author Evening featuring writer, editor, and teacher Zoë Bossiere, author of the striking literary memoir, Cactus Country. Zoë will be in conversation with Tammy Birk, Associate Professor of English at Otterbein University and Director of its Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. I'm Linda Cass. We're live streaming this program through Zoom webinar, and it will be recorded. And thanks to all of you in our audience for being with us this evening. Many thanks to this evening's community partners, Stonewall Columbus, as well as Otterbein University's Department of English and its program for Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And also thanks to Nikki Snyder for making all the technology work this evening. Let me preview the next hour or so for you. After introductions, Zoë and Tammy will talk for about 35 minutes. That will be followed by your questions submitted in the Q&A box, and that's typically located on the bottom of your screen if you're using a desk or a laptop. This is where Tammy will be taking your questions, not in the chat box, for Zoë during the latter portion of this program. In the Q&A box, you can write your questions at any time, and you can like questions already posed, which will bring them higher up on the screen, making them more likely to be asked. Another tool is the chat box. This allows you to chat among yourselves, but it will not be monitored by the panelists. Click on the chat box icon now. It will open a column on the right side of your screen with links to 2 upcoming Gramercy Books author programs. Registration is on Eventbrite. The first I want to mention is on July 18th at 7 p.m. It will be held at Gramercy Books, and we welcome Canadian writer Marianne Miller, who tells the story of Canada's role in the making of Ernest Hemingway in her debut novel, We Were the Bullfighters. Marianne will be in conversation with Ohio State University Hemingway expert Jim Phelan. And then on August 6th at 6:30, we host our bi-monthly Gramercy Book Club program, and the selection is Bear, authored by National Book Award finalist Julia Phillips. Her story is about the bonds of sisterhood and the mysteries of the animals that live among us and within us. Julia will join the in-store group virtually in the latter portion of the evening. The group discussion and the interview with Julia will be moderated by leading story scientist and author Angus Fletcher. You can click on the link to either of these programs to learn more about them, as well as to register. You can learn about all of Gramercy Books author programs on our website, gramercybooksbexley.com, and through our weekly e-newsletters. Now, let's meet tonight's guests. First, meet the person who will be in conversation with Zoë and tonight's moderator, Tammy Birk. Tammy is an associate professor of English at Otterbein University and has been director of its Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program since 2009. She regularly teaches in the Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies foundational core, as well as courses in experimental women's writing, contemporary graphic narrative, gender and madness, and seminars in topics as varied as disability cultures and Human/Animal, Seminar in Critical Animal Studies. She's the mother of 1 daughter. Tammy, welcome to Gramercy Books, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for asking me, Linda.
And it's my honor to introduce our featured guest this evening, Zoë Bossiere. In Cactus Country, Zoë tells an intimate story of becoming and belonging, of gender fluidity, class, and the American Southwest. The memoir captures the author's experience coming of age in a Tucson, Arizona trailer park, painting a portrait of the hot desert, of childhood and its constant developments, and of gender and its fluidity. Zoë is a writer, an editor, and teacher. They are the managing editor of Brevity, a journal of concise literary nonfiction, and co-editor of the anthologies The Best of Brevity and The Lyric Essay as Resistance, Truth from the Margins. Zoë lives in Oregon with her partner and child. Zoë, it's a thrill for Gramercy Books to host you this evening for our Central Ohio community and beyond.
Thank you, Linda. Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here tonight. I love Gramercy. I love Columbus. I spent a great deal of time in Athens, Ohio. So to be here tonight with all of you feels a little bit like coming home.
Thank you, Zoë. And now a warm welcome to Tammy Birk in conversation with Zoë Bossiere.
Hi, Zoe.
Hey, Tammy. Good to see you.
Good to see you again. So I had asked if you would be willing to read a brief excerpt from Cactus Country to open us up, and you graciously said yes. So we're going to begin with that before the conversation.
Yes, I would love to. So I think the best place to begin would be the beginning.
Okay.
I am going to go ahead and read a short section from the first chapter. This is about the first day in Cactus Country RV Park. I was 11 years old. My parents and I had moved from Reston, Virginia, across the country to live in this Airstream trailer that my father had purchased from an online auction site, kind of on an adventurous whim. And it was a new day for all of us. So here it is. My bare feet crunched against hot gravel as I scanned the pavement, searching in vain for campsite 198. I'd never felt so thirsty in my life. Under the heat of the Arizona sun, even my new short bowl-style haircut wasn't enough to keep me cool. I licked my cracked lips, blood salty on my tongue. Cactus Country was so much bigger than I'd expected. Its long roads leading me down endless campsite rows populated with RVs of every make and model, campers, coaches, pull trailers, park models, fifth wheels, and motorhomes. Miles of untouched desert surrounded the park on all sides, interrupted only by the interstate and the distant train tracks. I paused, squinting to make out a set of white numbers stenciled onto the asphalt. This was campsite 198, all right. Katie, the girl I'd played with earlier that afternoon, the one leading a sticky-faced toddler around, had asked me to meet her here after lunch. Paint peeled from her family's faded yellow camper like a bad sunburn. A shirtless boy about 11, my age, sat at a picnic table in the shade of the camper's ripped awning, chewing on a pen cap as he glared at the electronic game in his hands. "Your sister in there?" I asked, motioning to the trailer. The boy grunted, but didn't look up. I rapped my knuckles against the aluminum door frame. A gaunt woman with long, graying hair answered, a lit cigarette hanging from her lips. "Katie can't come out just now," she muttered, cigarette lilting as she spoke. Before I could open my mouth, she pulled the door shut again. Her raspy voice berated someone, maybe Katie, from inside the trailer. Thinking it best to wait, I took a seat beside the boy at the picnic table. "What are you playing?" I asked, leaning over to get a closer look at the screen. The game looked like a hand-me-down, at least 10 years old, with a faded black and green display. The boy didn't answer, but scooted farther across the bench, away from me. I sighed, staring at the broken toys littering the ground at my bare feet, their bright plastic fragments embedded in the dirt and scattered among the rocks. Reaching under the picnic table, I grasped at an action figure's disembodied leg. Without looking up from his game, the boy pulled a knife from his pocket. In one motion, he whipped it open, pointing its blade at my face. "If you touch that," he said, "I'll cut you." I froze, staring cross-eyed down the knife's sharp, gleaming tip. Before today, my vision of the Southwest had consisted of lonely cowboys on saddled horses, roving marauders in wooden stagecoaches, and bloody OK Corral-style shootouts against a vast landscape of sand. I knew the region had a violent history, but never expected another child to threaten me with a dollar store pocket knife. Flicking my eyes from the blade to the boy's fierce, angry gaze, I realized three things. First, this boy thought I was another boy. Second, his threat was a test. And third, if I had any hope of surviving here, I needed to pass it. Thank you.
Perfect. I didn't know you were going to do that. That's a excellent way in. So your parents made the decision to reinvent life for the three of you in
Mhm.
Tucson. You say that many times. And it wasn't just for them, even though your parents were, um, uh, they were very interesting. I was fascinated by your parents. I'm just going to say it right now. It's not part of the question, but I was fascinated by their eccentricities, their past lives as sea lion trainers for a Hungarian circus. I mean, these were two individuals that would have been absolutely opposed to a suburban life. And so they uprooted you with the promise of reinvention in Tucson, and you made good on that promise. Uh, you left Virginia ostensibly a girl, and then you chose to live and present as a boy once you reached Tucson at the age of 11. So I would love for you to start by talking about what moved you in the direction of boyhood and masculinity more generally, and also maybe talk to us about how crucial Tucson was, particularly Cactus Country, I understand, in
Mhm.
shaping it in a particular direction, because you could have been a boy anywhere, but you became a boy in Tucson.
Right. Yeah, those are great questions, Tammy. Thank you.
Sure.
Um, I would say that, so first of all, boyhood was something that I had yearned for a long time.
Okay.
So I grew up in Reston, Virginia, which is this kind of very suburban place. And I had come of age there as a girl very publicly. So that what that means is I went to preschool and school with the same kids year after year, and they knew me as Zoe the girl, even though I had always been more inclined towards boys' activities and things that interested boys. And so everyone would say, oh, well, Zoe's a tomboy, Zoe's a tough girl. And you know, secretly, right, because there wasn't a lot of language at the time that I grew up to really talk about what these feelings meant, right? Or even gender at all.
Yeah.
Uh, so for me, it meant that I had all of these sort of secret feelings about how I really wished that I was a boy instead of a girl. And I wished that I could inhabit the world that all of my friends who were boys seemed to inhabit without really thinking about it, right? And seemed to take for
Mhm.
granted. And so when my dad came to me and said, hey, we're moving to Tucson and it's going to be amazing. You can be whoever you want to be there. He really pitched it to me as this opportunity to be whoever we wanted to be, right? As people, as a family. Um, and what I wanted more than anything was to be this boy. And so I said to him, I want a haircut. And he was like, okay, like I already had short hair for a girl. And he was like, well, all right. I mean, if that's going to make this move easier, that's what we'll do. So I went and I got a bowl style haircut, quite short. Um, and suddenly, everyone I came across who didn't know me was like, oh, here's this little boy. I passed perfectly, and it was just a matter of kind of perfecting the technique, right? And
Right.
and I was a boy in public. So it was really a dream come true for me. And then we moved to Tucson, and of course, nobody knew me there. So I was able to be this boy. And moreover, we lived in this environment in Tucson it was a trailer park. So we had people moving in, not just like month by month, but often week by week or day by day. So I would encounter all of these other boys who I would make friendships with, like sometimes really close friendships, and then they would be gone very quickly. And so many of these boys never found out that I was anything but a boy. And it was a really interesting experience because I feel like if we had not moved to Tucson, and especially if we hadn't moved to Cactus Country, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to present and pass as this boy so readily. And my experience would have been completely different.
Because did Cactus Country feel like it was, um, you know, insulated from like a lot of circulation because it was surrounded by desert, and it seemed to me like it was almost an idyll, like it existed independently of a lot of outside influence, and the kids pretty much called the shots in the RV park. I mean, using the desert as obviously a playground, but
Yeah. Well, we
it
like to
felt
think
like it
that we
offered a
did.
kind of freedom, a very unique kind of freedom.
That's true. I think it's hard to say because I feel like childhood now is so different than childhood when I was growing up, and
Right.
childhood when I was growing up is so different than childhood when my parents were growing up. But Cactus Country did feel like it was sort of lost in time because it was a literal mile from the main
Right.
road. So we were set quite a ways back, surrounded by desert on all sides. Um, and so, yes, as children, we had this amazing freedom to just sort of roam all over the park, into the desert. Um, we basically were outside all day because our homes were RVs, and it's not really possible to spend a lot of time in an RV when, you're a group of kids.
Right.
Your parents are going to be like, get out of here. Um, so yeah, I really feel like Cactus Country was, like I said before, one of the perfect place, I think, to um I guess run this sort of experiment um and live authentically, at that time. That's who I felt I was. And I also think that Tucson is such an interesting place in and of itself. Cactus Country, I know Cactus Country, just because I had no way of knowing this when I made the decision to cut my hair, but it's this hyper masculine place.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
understand that now.
yeah, and you're familiar with Tucson,
Yeah,
Tammy, you've
yeah,
said. So
yeah.
you're sort of aware of the kind of people who are attracted to living in Tucson, the history of Tucson with the cowboys and the um, kind of Western expansion. And so there was definitely a lot of that I came into contact with as a kid that really shaped my understanding of masculinity and um, the kind of boyhood that I tried on and eventually made my own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is the romance of that for sure. Like the rugged, stoic, cowboy. But there's also, and I hope you don't mind me like asking about this. There's also, you name like a kind of pulsing, anger or rage. Sometimes you name it as a temper that was common to all of the boys and the boys that would become men and the men in Cactus Country. And it seemed like it was nearly impossible to avoid absorbing that or reckoning with it. I had a hard time imagining what would become of a boy without anger or rage there. The only one who seemed like it was Drew, who allowed himself to be beaten by his mother and
Yeah.
in order to spare his sisters and wouldn't retaliate against bullies. All of the other boys seemed to make their peace with anger and rage.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you asked that because I feel like that is really the core of a lot of the book.
Mhm.
Because I think that anger and rage, which was so present in the desert, I think for a lot of reasons, because Tucson is, for those who are unfamiliar, just deathly hot. It can
Yeah,
be so hot, especially in the summer. Temperatures can climb upwards of 100 degrees and do. And so imagine that heat and you're living in these little trailers without, great access to air conditioning. And a lot of the boys and men who I knew in the park were in these sort of working class families where there was a lot of desperation, destitution, sometimes addiction, sometimes chronic illness, just a lot of life circumstances that I think made them feel angry, which is understandable. And I also feel like that anger, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily inherent to masculinity, but I think it's
mhm,
common to it. And it's not just the desert, right? I think
right.
a lot of boys and men who I knew weren't even from Tucson. They were just there for a short period of time. But we all had this in common. And it's something that as a child, I attributed very much to the desert because it was something that I encountered for the first time there and was steeped in for the first time there. Um, so yeah, I feel like a really important part of the book, because for me as a boy, I had to first embrace the kind of anger and violence, right, that all of the other boys seem to be steeped in,
Oh yeah.
and kind of make it my own, make my peace with it in a way, in order to perform the kind of masculinity that we all performed, and to compete with one another. Um, and so I was exposed to many different kinds of this type of masculinity in my boyhood early on, until I encountered Drew, who you just mentioned. So
Right.
Drew, I was about 15, and Drew was my age, and we went to high school together. And he lived in the park for a time with his mother and sisters, and he just embodied this very different kind of masculinity, which was still very stoic, still very much a pillar. He was a strong person,
Yeah.
um, but he was not violent. He was
No.
very gentle, and he was very loving. And that was an example that I learned from, that I hadn't seen very often in the boys and men. Um, and I feel like through his example, it helped to inform and shape like my masculinity, even as I was beginning to move away from masculinity and boyhood at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seemed like, did you get about, would you say like a year or 2 years in which you were able to pass and present with relatively little complication? I mean, I forget when you said your period started, but when
Yeah.
adolescence sort of, like
Right.
to
Well, even
shift
with
things for
that,
you.
that's a good question too. So we moved there, I was 11 years old,
Right.
and uh, I was, I guess, around 14 or 15 when I started to sort of transition away from boyhood.
Oh,
And
okay. Oh, I don't know.
a
Mhm.
big reason for that was because I was reaching a point where it was harder and harder to pass as a boy, because all of the boys around me were getting deep voices, were growing really tall, were getting these Adam's apples, were getting really hairy and stinky. Not that I wasn't hairy and stinky, but not as hairy and stinky.
Right.
And I loved being a boy, and I still like I just loved my childhood so much. And I feel like I really thrived during that time, and it was really exciting and euphoric and all of these things. But nobody can be a boy forever, right? It
Right.
wasn't just me. Like all of the boys I knew were
No.
becoming men. And so for me, it was a really complicated question, because I was like, well, what's going to happen to me now?
Yeah.
Um, Now that I can't be a boy anymore, even though I still feel like I want to be one. Um, so that was a time in my life when I was really doing a lot of soul searching, a lot of searching on the internet for other
I
folks
saw
who
that.
had, yeah, similar experiences. And the internet was like newer at that time, and um, the awareness of trans issues, and even like the word non-binary, that was not uh, those weren't things that I came across,
Right.
even on the internet, at least the sites that I had access to and frequented. And so I was trying to sort of piece together at this point in my life, what does this mean? Like, why is it that I feel this way? And are there other people out there who feel the same way? And what do they call themselves?
Mhm.
What language do they use? It was this real search for these things. And I didn't find everything that I needed, but I did come across language like androgynous, So androgynous, people think of like David Bowie, this kind of
Right.
style,
Right.
that's masculine and feminine at the same time. But I heard of this, and I sort of used it like an identity, sort of like a proto non-binary identity, where it's like, I
Well
don't feel
said.
like I'm a boy. I don't feel like I'm a
Mhm.
girl. I just feel like I'm a person. Um, and so that's something that I uh, identified with for about a year or two, but it was very difficult, because at that time, basically nobody was aware of uh, what that meant, or they them pronouns weren't in common parlance, and
Not at all.
so it was an uphill battle, I felt, to openly be non-binary at that time.
Even the kids at the queer community center had no way to map you. you know? Like
Yeah.
I mean, you could be, you could live within the binary as a queer person, or you could ID as trans, again, within the binary, but they had no way of naming or comprehending even androgyny. Non-binary didn't seem to even be on the map as a possibility for you. Yeah, so you
Right.
began wearing a binder, you said, and you shifted to some neo pronouns and then to they, them, and it felt to me like you had a good run of it, like a decent, like there were some joys that were
Yeah.
made possible for your androgynous self, right? Early in high school.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Um, I felt very much like I had found something or tapped into something that felt true to who I
True.
was.
Yeah.
But I felt like I had tapped into it during a time when nobody understood where I was coming from. And not just, folks who, they're not really in tune with queer life or culture, but also, like you just mentioned, the queer youth group. So I went to a
Yeah.
queer youth group with my friend Angel, who
Mhm.
lived in the park. So Angel was this 20-year-old, I was like 14 at this time. He was this 20-year-old, very confident, very passionate gay man.
Mhm.
And he was sort of like my link to queer culture and introduction to it in Cactus Country because we just didn't have a lot of young queer people
Right. Of
way out there in the desert,
course.
Um, so he and I became pretty good friends. And so we went to this queer youth group in town together. And at that time, we introduced ourselves, and I was I was met with a lot of skepticism from
Mhm.
some of the other teenagers there who I think had this idea that like, well, if you're
Right.
transgender, then you're either a trans woman or you're a
Mhm.
trans man, and that's the
Mhm.
beginning and the end of it. Um, and same thing with sexuality. So Angel would always say that bisexuality wasn't really a valid way to feel because, according to him, anybody who like claimed that they were bi was really just a closeted gay man
Yeah.
or a straight woman who wanted to titillate straight men, right? Um, which of course isn't true, but like this was the common idea at the time. And there didn't seem to be or feel like there was a lot of room for nuance in those conversations.
Not at
So
all. Not
I
at all.
had a hard time finding where I fit.
Well, I thought that I got to tell you and tell everyone that's like tuning in that I was very absorbed by Zoe's evolution, the kind of unfolding that is so clear and so like compelling in the book. And I thought that you were ready to settle into, sort of sold me on androgyny. I thought you were ready to sort of like settle and nest into it as the best available, I get a way of naming or IDing your gender, but that didn't hold. That didn't hold, and it's in part, but I don't want to say that it's entirely. That's for you. In part, because of really difficult in a really difficult chapter, Bird on Fire, you were sexually assaulted, raped, really, by your girlfriend. You were in a relationship. It was an alcohol and weed facilitated um, situation.
Mhm.
It took a hammer to you. It broke me to read that chapter. It was a really difficult one. And I, as a reader, had to sort of recover and come back. I almost felt like in real time with you. On the other side of it, it felt like, well, I didn't feel like, I know you told us that you couldn't sustain your androgynous self-presentation. You seem to abandon, in some way, like caring about gender at all. Is
Yeah.
that right? Or
No, you got it. Yeah. So
okay,
that event it was very difficult for me because
good.
at the time, so we were just talking about how there's not really a lot of room for nuance during conversations in that time, even in queer
Mhm.
spaces. And so at that time, I was dating a girl, um, and we had been together. And so we had this experience together where um, essentially I was taken advantage of. And there was no language at that time to talk about that experience. So now we can use words like sexual assault, we can use words like rape, but at that time, the way that I conceptualized rape was there's a man and there's a woman, or there's a man and there's a girl, and
Right.
it's a dark alley and they're strangers. And I feel like folks weren't even having meaningful conversations about date rape at that time. So it was something that I felt a lot of shame about, and I felt like I couldn't talk about it because I didn't even know where to begin. And it was just one of those experiences where, you're carrying that with you every day. It's weighing you down because it's living inside of you. And so for me, I had already kind of been struggling to be androgynous or non-binary in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a lot of energy, right? When you have to go out to the world and sort of educate people on a daily
All the
basis
time.
about who you are and why. And at school, definitely I got a lot of questions about that on a daily basis. And so um, after this happened to me, I really felt like I didn't have the energy to think about gender anymore. And I felt such shame in myself and in my body that I just wanted to punish it. I didn't want to take care of it. And so what that looked like for me was, just giving up on trying to present any particular way. Because any way that you present, no matter what your gender is, takes some work, right?
Yeah.
And upkeep and care. So for me, I just stopped getting my hair cut, I stopped wearing my binder. I started wearing really dark clothing. I just kind of wanted to blend in and not stand out. And I didn't want to attract attention to myself. I was really processing what had happened to me still. And the consequence of that was, as soon as I stopped putting energy and time into my gender presentation, the more and more other people started to view me as this girl or this woman.
Right.
And so that changed things quite a bit at that point.
Did you answer to she and her pronouns at that time? You did
I
mention
did.
in the book.
Yeah, I did. I really didn't care what anybody called me at that point.
Okay.
So I just embraced that at that time.
Hmm.
And, I talk a little bit in the book about how that didn't quite feel right to me, but
No.
nothing really did. And the energy it would take to kind of reestablish myself as um, an androgynous or a non-binary person was just too much at that time to really merit consideration.
Yeah, you called it an uneasy femininity,
Right,
as you were a girl who didn't feel very much like a girl, but nonetheless, like you were attracting especially sexual and romantic attention from, I mean, both men in high school and then later in college. You go on to
right,
have a couple of relationships, potentially more that you didn't write about, but in which you felt a little hamstrung by the expectations of, understandably, of a girlfriend. Um, but so, but I want to like talk about school because I know our time is going to run out, and
mhm,
I want everyone to know that you went to the University of Arizona on a full scholarship and discovered, I guess that's maybe the word, creative writing. The Department of English became a kind of, it seemed to me like a kind of sanctuary for you, and writing allowed you to begin to like to tell some truths that maybe had been less available for you previously. It felt like it cracked something open in you, the creative writing years. I didn't know if you wanted to be cracked open. That wasn't clear, but it did that. It had that effect.
right. Yeah, it did. You know, I so when I went to college, um, I went very reluctantly. I
Mhm.
didn't feel ready for it.
Right.
Didn't feel ready for the responsibilities, the demands, like the academic demands of
Mhm.
taking classes and balancing work and school and life and all of that. I was just sort of recovering from this event, and was really starting to get my footing again, so at the time I was working as a preschool teacher at a
Yeah.
local school, and I really, really loved that work. I loved working with the kids. And I was very focused on that, and I didn't really want to split my time between that and
Right.
school. But I had gotten a scholarship. It was completely unexpected,
That's
and
amazing.
it was something that I qualified for based on merit and based on income. And it's called the Arizona Assurance
Mm,
Program. And it's a really
okay.
amazing program. Like truly, it changed my life. I wouldn't be here today without that. Um, but at the time I was terrified because I really didn't feel ready, and I didn't know what I wanted to study or do with my life. And I also just didn't understand how college worked, like on a really
Yeah.
mental level. Like I just didn't understand what office hours were for, or like how to use the library, like really basic things that I just needed a lot of help with. So it took me a long time to find my footing, and I was undeclared for quite a while, like what my major
Mm.
would be. Partly that was because I didn't know what that meant. And,
Yeah.
and then I took a creative writing class, and I was like, I had no idea that a person could study this in school, you know.
I believe it.
I'd always loved reading and writing, and so I really threw myself into that. And I had some incredible mentors, who I think really saw how ardently I was focused on my craft and becoming a better writer. And I think they, as any teacher does, I think really appreciated that and wanted to nurture it. And so I really feel like it was such a lucky thing to happen in my life. And it did crack something open in me. I feel like even though I wasn't writing about this story at that time, I was
Right.
actually writing a lot about my parents' time in the circus.
Circus, I know. Well,
Um,
that's kind of fascinating.
it is and was. And so I was
Yeah.
spending a lot of time doing that. And um, I I feel like it really prepared me to write this story one day, that whole experience. And
So
I'm
you
very
start,
grateful for it.
so you started in grad school and let me make sure that I have this right.
Yeah,
It feels to me like you were continuing to not think about gender. You went to an MFA program in Oregon, then you came to Ohio University, for a
right.
PhD, and it felt like you sort of had you had iced, or sort of sidelined many of your questions about gender, or maybe you were trying to just perform a certain kind of like academic role, like in grad school. But it took some time for you to weave your way back to the story of the desert boy, which ultimately is the story, is the story of your gender journey. And I guess the question I had while reading was, I wondered if you were afraid in any way to revive him, which I would have totally understood. Or just at some point, did it become necessary for you to do so, like unavoidable for you to?
Hmm. Hmm. That's a fantastic question. So I would say that I stridently avoided thinking about gender through,
Okay, stridently. All
through
right. Okay.
graduate school.
It felt
Um,
strong. Hmm.
well, a big reason for that was because I really did feel like I needed to perform this kind of academic person. I felt like I was
Oh,
already sort of at a disadvantage because I, unlike a lot of my colleagues, I quickly learned, I had come from, this trailer park and this kind of
yeah.
working class background that was kind of unusual at that level. And so I felt like I needed to account for that. I didn't want anybody to know kind of how I had grown up, trailer park and boyhood. And on top of that, I also felt like, okay, well, so if people are perceiving me as this woman in academia, I need to be this certain type of woman
Oh,
because, you know, you want to be like seen as determined and motivated, but you don't want to be seen as pushy, like there's just
oh,
this kind of I feel like all women have to grapple with this to some extent when they're in a professional setting. And I was learning all of that for the first time because I wasn't super familiar with the rules, because I hadn't been a woman for that long, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I spent a lot of time really not thinking about gender as much as I could, but strangely, I was performing gender more than ever before, like I was making these active decisions about how I looked, what to wear, how to be this like very professional feminine person, even though I wasn't really that, so it takes extra work to be something you're not. Um, so there was that whole element to it for sure. And when I left Tucson, I really felt like I never want to go back. Like I never want
Yeah,
to
I
come
got
back to
that.
Tucson
Mm-hmm.
again. And so I was trying to put all of that behind me. So I went to graduate school in Oregon for 2 years. And then I got into my doctoral program in Athens, Ohio. And I was there for 5 years. It's a long time.
Long time.
So toward the like middle of that program, I had been away for like 5 years. And I was really starting to miss home in a lot of ways. I was thinking more about Tucson. I was thinking about my childhood. I was thinking about what it meant. My partner and I were sort of gearing up to have a child, all of these things were sort of coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to write the things that I remembered from my childhood. And the more that I wrote these things, the more that I remembered from my childhood, the more that I remembered this boy and his perspective. And that's what guided the entire book. I kind of let him lead the way.
Wow. And in the midst of this, as you're sort of resurrecting these stories, I think there's some friends of yours from OU, if my timeline is right. Some friends of yours ask you if you are in fact gender fluid. Um, and I don't know if you had heard that word before. No, you had heard of it, but you had assumed that it meant something else, that it was more of a, it was, you assume that the shifting, like the gender shifting, was occurring more rapidly, like,
Right.
presenting and IDing as a boy in the morning and a girl in the afternoon, like, or the next day, or what have you. You didn't imagine it, like, you didn't think that that there was a longer arc, perhaps, for the change and transition. But you write in the book, like, and I'm telling you, at this moment I had no idea, like, I didn't know, like, what had become of your relationship to gender. And when you sort of, you lifted up the word, like, I felt it in my body. Like, yes, that is exactly what Zoe has been living. And you say that you then reclaim the they them pronouns. And so I would love for you to, like, share with the audience, like, how, why, and you use them still today, uh,
Mhm.
the ways in which understanding yourself as gender fluid, which you do right now, okay, allows, like, how it's similar or different from maybe a trans or a trans masculine identity, or a non-binary identity. Not that has to be hard and fast for everyone, but just as you perceive it, what does naming yourself as gender fluid allow you to understand and say about yourself to others?
Yeah, well, so when that language was proposed to me, like you said, at first, my understanding of gender fluidity was that it's a word that folks like. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with uh, the Queer Eye show.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's a guy on the show, or a person on the show named Jonathan Van Ness, and he uses he they pronouns. Really embodies gender fluidity on like an episode by episode basis. So Jonathan will come some days wearing like a dress and high heels, and other days more masculine attire, and loves to sort of play with their hair and, just embody all of these different ways of presenting oneself. And they'll often wear whatever they're wearing with a beard, so
Right.
that was my conception of what gender fluidity was, somebody whose gender expression is sort of changing day by day, you
Right.
know, somebody who plays with that. Whereas it can also mean, and I didn't know this, but it can also comprise like much longer periods of time. So for me, there have been times in my life that lasted years where I identified with one specific gender, like in boyhood, right? I was
Mhm.
definitely a trans
Yes.
boy.
Mhm.
Then later, like embracing this androgyny. And then after that, this kind of uneasy femininity. And nevertheless, you know, I still felt like a woman. Um, and so gender fluidity is a word that encompasses a journey like that, essentially. So I think it can mean many different things to many different people, but that's what it means to me. Um, and so I do identify as a trans person. I do feel like in my day-to-day expression now, it is a lot more feminine. And I've been trending more toward sort of like a non-binary uh, way of dressing and presenting myself. You know, I'm kind of like finding comfort in the space between masculinity and femininity a lot more, especially since I wrote Cactus Country. And,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
you know, I feel like writing a book in many ways, you know, folks imagine that, oh, well, you know what you want to write and then you write it. But often it's a journey, right? Like you're writing this book and you're
It felt
discovering these
like it.
things about yourself. And so that's definitely been true for me.
It absolutely felt like a journey. I want to just say one last thing, and then we have some questions that are, if any of you have additional questions, please add them to the Q&A so that I can ask them of Zoe. Um, you wrote, and this is just how I kind of want to end it between you and me. You wrote that when you started writing Cactus Country, I wanted to tell the story the boy I was had been searching for. And there were two reasons that I could see, like why you would want to do that or need to do that. One, your words, the boy I was does not know that there are other children like him. He only knows his own body, his own desert. The boy only knows how to survive. So part of the reason that you needed to tell this story, you know, was to, I think, make him visible. Two, you also wanted to know how a story like yours would end. And you spent a lot of years feeling like you could never find an ending, which is why I love the fact that you named the final chapter, as like on the nose as it is, how it ends. I
Yeah.
love that you named that because it felt to me like you were always looking for, as a lot of us are, like you were always looking for a possible future, you know, a possible ending, especially one that did not resolve in despair and inauthenticity, not only for yourself, but also for your readers. And I felt like the way you concluded this book, and I'll leave it to people to like discover it for themselves, was a very generous, I see you, um, for your readers as well. There's too many people in power right now trying to ensure despair and inauthenticity, the very things you're trying to, um, you want your story, you know, not to resign. You don't want your story to resign yourself to these. There's too many people trying to ensure that. And I really did see your book as a form of resistance. And I'm borrowing from your book, you know, the lyric essay is resistance, in understanding that you do succeed in challenging assumptions about not only like what we've been, but also what we can become very effectively. Uh, and I cannot recommend this memoir enough. I intend on teaching it at Otterbein, and I would strongly recommend my fellow teachers who are on here to think about doing the same or opening this up, my Stonewall people, to a book circle. It's a beautiful, bracing, you know, and much needed book for this moment that we share.
Thank you, Tammy.
Okay.
That means
Oh, you're
a lot
so
to me.
welcome, Zoe. Okay, I've got a few questions for you here. Okay, Suzanne Ashworth asks first, were there angers that you felt or experienced as more inherent to femininity as you grew up? Did femininity have its own angers?
Oh my God, yes.
That's
Yes.
a good question.
It's a fantastic question. Yes, I definitely felt angry a lot, and in unexpected ways when I started presenting and identifying more femininely. And there's actually a chapter in the book that gets into this sort of deeply, where I'm living with a lot of young men, and we're
Mm-hmm.
roommates, and I'm behaving in a lot of the same ways that these young men are, but
Yeah.
somehow the way that they perceive me is very different than how they perceive each other. So for example, like if I were to, so we would have lots of house parties. We were young and that was what we did. And so like if I allowed our guests to like sleep in my room, to crash in my room,
Oh, yeah.
these friends of mine would say like, oh, well, she's such a slut, like she allows anybody to do that. Meanwhile, like, there's no problem if they have, people staying with them. So there was this like incredible double standard that like I had definitely been aware of as a young child, and really didn't like. Um, but yeah, it was something I came up against all the time and still come up against a
Yeah,
lot.
I
And
bet.
it's extremely frustrating and it's degrading and humiliating and yeah. So yeah, I feel like there's a whole other book in there that could be,
Yeah, yeah.
you know,
I would love to read it, Zoe. I would love to read it.
thank you. Yeah.
Sandra B asks, it seems to me, I'm quoting, it seems to me that there was a letting go of certain emotions to become the boy that you wanted to be. You had to let go to be in the trailer, thinking of China, thinking of the dog, and other issues. Were those things that caused you to feel as if you um, had to neglect? Did you feel like you had to neglect some of these things in order to fit in?
Yeah, sometimes. For sure. So there's a chapter kind of early on where I'm still kind of figuring out how to be a boy, like how to act as a boy, how to be among other boys.
Mm-hmm.
And we end up like really brutally sort of
Yes.
massacring these Palo Verde beetles. So Palo Verde beetles are these like very large, kind of scary looking insects that live underneath Palo Verde trees and they burrow into their roots. And we thought it was very exciting to kind of draw them out of their holes and then murder them. And it was something that we did all the time. And I had a lot of like reservations about it. It didn't feel right to me to do this. And I didn't like the idea that we were causing this suffering. And it could be that all the other boys felt the same way, but somehow we were all like in this together and nobody could talk about that aspect of it. So I definitely felt like I needed to bury how I felt in order to fit in. And then there were other times where I felt like I needed to kind of bury how I was feeling in order to be a man who does the right thing. So like in the instance of China, so China, for those who aren't familiar with the book, is this like little pit bull who I ended up taking care of for quite a while after a neighbor essentially abandoned her. And my father really didn't want to keep China. We already had a dog, and he just felt like that was not a responsibility that he wanted. And I was very like ardently attached to this
Mhm.
dog, keeping this dog. And so we had this sort of standoff about it. And in the end, I did end up giving her up
Yeah.
to a family that wanted to adopt her, a family that had much more means than we did. And that was something that I really, I think I wouldn't have been able to do, or I wouldn't have had the maturity to do without the influence of my friend Drew, who we
Yeah.
talked about a little
Yeah.
earlier, who
Right.
was always making these kinds of self-sacrifices for his sisters, for their care. And so I feel like there were instances of both, like some where I was compromising how I felt, to fit in for the
Mm-hmm.
works, and
Yeah.
others where I was compromising how I felt to do the right thing.
Yeah. Well said. I mean, yeah, well said. Um, s- I think this might be Audrey. I know that you briefly mentioned that the internet was a fairly new concept during the duration of your transition and it was difficult to find information. Were there any forms of media or resources that did help you to explain these feelings to people around you? How about, has the discovery of new information impacted your relationship with gender and the ways that you describe all of this?
Oh, that's a wonderful question too.
Mhm.
These are also
Thank
thoughtful.
you, Audrey.
Yeah, so one thing so the internet was a little bit limited at the time,
Right.
amazingly.
It's hard. I know it's hard to believe, but it really were you on Tumblr mostly? Or were you in online discussion forums? No. Okay.
I was on this website called Gaia Online that I'm
Oh,
sure has
Gaia.
been
You did say
forgotten.
Gaia. Hmm.
Yeah, and it's just this very like of its time website. I'm sure it's still around. And I'm sure that the people who use it are my age because that's when we all started using it. But anyway, so it was a discussion forum, and that's the website that I used for the most part. I feel like Tumblr was maybe like for an older group at that
Okay.
time,
Okay.
or maybe hadn't quite hit its stride when I was online. And so yeah, I had a lot of difficulty finding this information. I would find occasionally like blogs by trans masculine people talking about like how to bind, right? Or occasionally there might be some essay that somebody had written somewhere about like feeling sort of in between, you know. I was looking for anything that I could find, um, and really not coming up with very much. And I came across a book that was incredibly helpful to me by
Mm-hmm.
Kate Bornstein. And I did not know about Gender Outlaw. I would have loved that too. But this book was called My Gender Workbook.
Yeah.
And it was essentially this like tome with lots of quiz questions about, you
Yeah.
know, like just different scenarios like gender in the workplace and, you know, gender when you're going on a date and, you know, gender in the bedroom, like things that were probably a little bit above my, you know, kind of developmental level at that time. But it was the first book that I'd ever encountered that was like very open and playful about the fact that you don't have to be a man or a woman, you know, or that some people aren't. And I read that book until the spine came undone. I mean, I did the quiz so many times. I like my parents were probably like, "Oh, we're so tired of these questions," because I would ask them all the time, you know, or to my friends. And so that book was really helpful to me. And I write a little bit about that in Cactus Country. And it was
Mhm.
the only one. Like there was, I feel like
Was
now
it?
there are so many
Oh
like
my
gender
God.
workbook type books that
Oh yeah.
you can get that really explain all of this very clearly and are targeted at the right age groups, because I think that Kate Bornstein's book was really meant for like adults. It wasn't for teens, you know, trying to figure it out.
Right.
Um, but it was a great book. And so now I feel like there are all of these resources out there. There are things that like if I'm trying to explain something to someone and they don't quite get it, I could definitely refer them to another book or to even sometimes a film or, you
Mm.
know, some other type of art that expresses kind of the way that I feel. I feel like it's something that's definitely out there in a way that it wasn't before.
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay, last question, because I don't want to keep people on too long, but I know I speak for Zoe and I, we're both grateful that you're still here with us. This
Yes.
is from Jean Kelly. Hi, Jean. I'm curious about your process of writing memoir, which you characterized as a journey. For example, did you understand something new about yourself because of the writing process? Did you have any difficult decisions about what and how to reveal, especially about family? Or as the amazing Dinty Moore, whom you know from OU, well, very well,
Very
and
well, yeah.
brevity. Or as the amazing Dinty Moore once said, quote, I believe more people have been harmed over time by secrets and concealment than by candor and revelation, end quote. Thank you,
Yeah,
Jean.
that's a good question too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I feel like it's a little bit unusual in that so my memoir isn't really about my family, you know. So a couple of people have asked me about this because typically like memoirs, at least like classic memoirs are very focused on like, you
Hmm.
know, my mother was this, you know, strange person or my
Right.
father. And I do have very like eccentric parents who I love. Um, but they're really not like the antagonists of the
They're
book at
not.
all.
Not at all. Mm-mm.
And so, for me, the real difficulty of writing the book was trying to understand how and why I'd felt the way that I did, and then from there, trying to understand what it meant for me now in the present, what it meant for my gender, what it meant for what kind of person I am, and that was truly the challenge of writing the book. And so to do that, I started with these moments in childhood, the moments when we were killing the beetles, right? Or these conversations I had with my friend Drew, or, whatever it was. And I started with what I remembered and worked from there. And so for me, the challenge was like piecing everything together in a way that would allow me to learn something about myself, right? That would allow me to kind of look back and say, oh, this is what that means. I didn't know that then, but I do know it now. So I feel like that aspect of writing the book was at once the most difficult and also just by far the most rewarding and consequential.
Absolutely. Beautiful. The self-coherence that is sort of I guess, the prize at the end.
Yeah.
Linda, would you like to come back and help us end this terrific conversation?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Zoe. What an extraordinary and illuminating conversation. Cactus Country reveals the complexity of becoming. And Zoe, your voice in this striking memoir shines with curiosity and empathy. And Tammy, you've been an amazing conversation partner tonight. So to both of you, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. Um, we're very grateful.
If you haven't picked up a copy yet, head over to Gramercy Books in Bexley if you're in Columbus, okay? Or place an order for it, or pick it up at your local library, or ask them to buy it. It's truly an incredible text.
Well, I was going to say that we've added a link in the chat box, and where any of you in the audience can purchase a copy of Cactus Country if you haven't already, or you may want to get another for someone you know. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. There's also links in the registration with registration to Gramercy's upcoming author programs. Gramercy's open until Labor Day. We're open 9 to 8 on Monday through Saturday and 10 to 6 on Sunday. We offer curbside pickup. And again, we are so grateful, Tammy, for your excellent work as a conversation partner. And Zoe, this is an incredible, extraordinary memoir. I'm thrilled to know that Tammy's going to use it at online. That's fantastic. So just want to thank you all for spending part of your evening with us, and we hope you'll join us again soon.
Absolutely. You heard it about it here, everybody, because I'm telling you, this is gonna pick up a lot of traction, praise, and press. So tonight's the night you first heard of it. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch with you, Zoe. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Gramercy. This has been an incredible night.
Thank you.